Let's continue our lesson on factoring. This time our objective is to factor trinomials with coefficients bigger than 1. We can use the same techniques as trial and error and box method, and we'll learn a new trick. Let's take a look at our first example. Let's try to factor 2x squared minus x minus 6. We're going to use the box method like the one we used in the last lesson. The only difference is now we have a coefficient of 2 instead of negative 1. But the same process can be applied to this situation. So like before, we put the leading term of 2x squared in the upper left-hand corner. The middle term of negative x goes in the circle, and the constant term of negative 6 goes in the lower right-hand corner of the box. The only difference with this example is we're not just looking for factors of negative 6. We're looking for factors of the coefficient of 2 times negative 6, which is negative 12. So let's list all the factors of negative 12. Well, 1 and negative 12, negative 1 and positive 12, 3 and negative 4, negative 3, positive 4, 2 and negative 6, negative 2, and positive 6. And again, like before, we're looking at factors of negative 12 that add up to the middle term of negative 1x. Which factors of negative 12 add up to negative 1? If you look, 3 plus negative 4 is negative 1. So that's what we put in the other boxes. And again, it doesn't matter where you put those. Just remember to put those with the variable that we're using, which is x. So negative 4x and positive 3x. Now we look at the columns and rows. And again, like before, we factor out the greatest common factor from each column and each row. If you look at the first column of 2x squared and 3x, the greatest common factor there is x. Looking at the second column, the greatest common factor between negative 4 and negative 6 is, in fact, negative 2. If you look at the first row, the greatest common factor between 2x squared and negative 4x is 2x. In the second row, the greatest common factor between 3x and negative 6 is positive 3. And again, you have your factors on the outside of the box of x minus 2 times 2x plus 3 inside the parentheses. This is the fully factored form of our polynomial. Here we're going to look at another way in factoring trinomials with a coefficient. You notice that our coefficient here is 6. This is known as the trick. What we do is actually drop the coefficient and keep the first two terms as x squared plus 7x. Instead of writing the constant term of negative 3, what we're going to do is take the first coefficient of 6 times negative 3, which gives us negative 18. We're going to factor this trinomial like we would before, using trial and error or box method, setting up our two parentheses, x and x, and factors of negative 18 that add up to the middle term of positive 7 are positive 9 and negative 2, because 9 times negative 2 gives us negative 18, and 9 plus negative 2 gives us positive 7 as our middle term. Here's where we introduce the coefficient that we dropped from before. What we do with that coefficient, which is 6 in this case, we want to divide each of the numbers inside the parentheses by the coefficient. So taking 9 divided by 6 and negative 2 divided by 6. So again, dropping the coefficient and dividing it by both of the numbers. The next step is to reduce these fractions. So the x plus 9 over 6 becomes x plus, reducing 9 over 6 becomes 3 over 2 times x minus 2 over 6 becomes 1 over 3. The very last step in this process is whatever's on the denominator in our fractions, which is 2 and 3, those numbers go in front of the x as our coefficients. This gives us our final answer, fully factored form of parentheses 2x plus 3 times 3x minus 1. And again, you can always check your work by doing the FOIL method to see if we get the original polynomial. Again, this is a shortcut, a lot nicer way of using this method. Let's take a look at our last example. Let's factor 3x squared plus 11x minus 4. Here I want to show you the box method and the trick method, both side by side, so that you can decide which method you prefer. If we look at let's start with the box method. So if we look at our leading coefficient of 3x squared, that's what goes inside the upper left-hand corner of the box. What goes in the middle of the box is our middle term of 11x, and the constant term going in the lower right-hand corner of the box is negative 4. Reminding you that we're not looking for factors of negative 4, but we're looking for factors of 3 times negative 4 when there's a coefficient. So 3 times negative 4 gives us negative 12. Listing out the factors of negative 12, which ones add up to a positive 11? Well, positive 12 and negative 1 add up to positive 11. Just remember, we need to add our variables of x to both of those. The next step with the box method is to look at the first column. In finding the GCF between 3x squared and negative 1x, we have a GCF of just x. Looking at the second column of 12x and negative 4, the greatest common factor here is positive 4. Now we look at the rows. What can we factor out of 3x squared and positive 12x? Well, the greatest common factor here is positive 3x. The very last row, negative 1x and negative 4. Notice that they're both negatives, so the greatest common factor here is actually a negative 1 that we can pull out. The factors, of course, are located at the top and the left-hand side of the box, so it becomes x plus 4, parentheses, times 3x minus 1 to give our final factored form. Let's look at the last method, which is the trig method. Remember, the first step in the trig method is to drop the coefficient. Here we drop the coefficient of 3, keeping the first two terms of x squared plus 11x. To get the very last term of this trinomial, we take the leading coefficient of 3 and multiply it by the constant term, which gives us negative 12. We factor this like any other factor before. We could use trial and error box method, but I know that it's split up into two sets of parentheses. We have an x and an x. And now we're looking for factors of negative 12 that add up to positive 11. Notice that positive 12 and negative 1 add up to positive 11. The next step is to introduce the coefficient that we dropped from before. And remember, we divide that coefficient by each number inside the parentheses. So taking 12 divided by 3 and negative 1 divided by 3. The only last part to do here is simplify the fractions. If you notice, simplifying the first set of parentheses, it becomes x plus 12 over 3, which is 4. And remember, any denominator on the bottom becomes the coefficient in front of x for the parentheses. So the last set of parentheses becomes our 3x minus 1, as we got in the last example, as the box method. So I will leave it up to you which method you prefer. It's totally your choice. But tomorrow, come ready to practice some problems, and hopefully have a great night.